Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchami, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchami, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchami. So welcome everybody to Tuesday meditation. And so it was a nice weekend. This weekend we had our retreat, and it was beautiful weather. Got this kind of a very summer-like weather, and it's kind of a nice time. About several of us came here and did some kind of meditation in silence. And this kind of thing is kind of interesting because at the beginning of the retreat, most of the people who'd been to this particular retreat, sometimes different, there's a mixture of people with different experience levels, but most of the people at this retreat had been on retreats before, I think, had been meditating for a while. So that meant that could sit in silence, quite a bit, could sit in silence most of the time. And I remember going on my first, earliest meditation retreats, and the whole thing would be like silence, you'd have these, they wouldn't even talk. They would use these clackers to signal when things were done. You'd have a bell to signal when the sitting was done, and you'd have this a bamboo clacker that they'd use to signal when it's starting, time to move, And so basically the whole retreat, for the retreatants, some of the people who were arranging meals and things like that would talk, but the whole retreat was in silence. And this was, quite a powerful, experience for me. This silence has this quality to it that can be healing, or it can be something that can throw people in very bad directions. It's this double-pronged quality to it. Most of these things, this thing that can be a very great opportunity, or it can be something that's very damaging, depending on how one grasps onto it. And it's for this reason that on retreats, that people do things together as a group. You do all this meditation as a group. Everything is done as a group, except for the walking portions. Eating is generally done. Everything is supervised. And that's to give, especially I know for myself on this first retreat, that was to give people, at least I found it very helpful, this structure to the silence. Because without this structure, then silence can go off in all kinds of directions. I remember there was I think I read it somewhere, at some point I was reading about psychology, at some point, and they had this thing where if a person, one of the theories behind a talk therapy, where a person goes and talks and talks, is that what these psychologists found is that when a person keeps talking, their a speech, I guess as far as I remember, I don't know how to describe it, degenerates. It hones in on certain problems and then keeps repeating them. So if you keep talking, eventually you start talking about something negative. And this is actually one of the things that's in the suttas as well. It's the dangers of speaking too much. You speak useless words, you speak harsh words, you speak animal, you speak negative words. That's not specifically in the suttas, but all these forms of wrong speech happen when people start talking a lot. And this talk isn't something that's explicitly confined to external speech. Right now I'm talking. I hope the talk doesn't go down. But right now I'm talking. And this is an external mode of speech. Speaking to people, people can hear me. But inside people's minds, they all have this speech going on. It's internal dialogue that happens. And it's this internal dialogue that if it isn't properly managed, if it isn't properly channeled, that can lead people in all sorts of directions that aren't good for them, lead people in directions that are bad for them. And this is why this kind of silence presents both an opportunity but a challenge. And most things like that are truly beneficial, have this sense to them that there's an opportunity there, but there's also this challenge. So when a person sits in silence for a period of time, especially with a group, if one does it for like a day, then, it's kind of, you get to notice something. You do it for like 4, 5, 6 days. They even have 10-day retreats, And then, if you go live in solitude without anybody else around, what you find is that what one finds is that if a person keeps their focus on their meditation object, it's like all their thoughts have these levels. The thoughts can have like these levels to them. Like a level, they have it has like a base maybe, and the thoughts grow up from this base. And then if a person keeps practicing, the thoughts keep going, and your practice hits this base. So if this person keeps practicing in silence, doesn't follow their train of thought, that base dissolves, in a sense. This is where things get difficult. Because it's almost like the thoughts that occur in a person's head have a life of their own. So one of the interesting things is that oftentimes, at least I know for myself, growing up in the West, I have this kind of idea, like, all these thoughts that are in my head, they belong to me. Whatever thought comes into my head, that's my thought. Whatever thing happens, that's my thought. These feelings that happen in my head, they belong to me. And so on the basis of this, a person forms an idea about who they really are, about what their character really is. But the Buddha teaches us to kind of put this aside, and there's for good reasons for this. Because one of the things is that whatever thought comes into a person's head, if they think that it's really them, it really belongs to them, there's a danger that they'll follow it. There's a danger that they won't let that thought go. They won't let it pass when it should pass. They won't cultivate the ones that should be cultivated. And what this means is that if they don't do this, their mind is like one of those things like the psychologist found, where it just keeps going and going and going until it settles on something negative, until it goes to something negative. And this negative thing can just keep repeating. It's like one of the interesting things at least in modern kind of Western Buddhist thought is that as Buddhism came to the West, there was this kind of desire. Kind of people here in the West, the main religion in the West now is basically like science. People don't go to church, but they learn about the doctrines of science. And they may not know the studies, how the scientists constructed the studies that give whatever results they give, may not know the kind of data that they use, the sources that they used, but the results of scientific studies get disseminated in popular magazines, get disseminated in school, and so people know the doctrines of science. And so when Buddhism came to the West, or is still in the West, there's a need to explain the Buddhist teachings in terms of scientific terminology, in terms of scientific theories, and in terms of scientific knowledge as it is at its current state, because this is what people know. That's how they build their worldview. And so one of the interesting things that came out of this, at least, was that the Buddha has this kind of teaching on dependent origination. Basically, there's these ways that things kind of arise. They arise dependent on this cause, on this cause, on this cause, on this cause. And one of the interesting things that came out of this kind of merging was that somebody noticed, it was a monk named Ajahn Thanissaro, he noticed an overlap between kind of dependent origination, what we might call kind of like, I can't remember, what's it called, like, it's kind of like a chaos theory. Kind of, in other words, dependent origination and this kind of chaos theory, they have these unpredictable feedback loops to them. There's kind of like, if you take a microphone and you put it near like a speaker, might not want to do that, but, the sound that comes from, even if it's a small sound, like in the environment, like something, like somebody goes like this or a cough, then the microphone picks up that sound and puts it into the speaker, and the speaker puts the sound out, and the microphone picks it up, and then the microphone puts it back into the speaker, and it keeps getting louder and louder until you get this whine, like, kind of very loud whine. And one of the interesting ways about the way that these relationships arise in the Buddhist teaching on dependent co-arising, there's all these feedback loops. Kind of notice I won't, go through all the sets, but when you go through the definitions of each term, you find that some of them are duplicates. You got one here and you got one here. In other words, there's different ways that these things can feed back into each other and make that loop stronger and stronger and stronger the more that the feedback occurs, the more that it gets emphasized. And so it's in this way that a person who doesn't restrain their thoughts properly, who doesn't manage their thoughts properly when they're in silence, when they're alone inside their head, their thoughts form a feedback loop. And if they're not careful, the feedback loop can become negative, can become something that is unpredictable, goes off in strange ways. And it's in precisely this, it's in this way that silence can be dangerous for people. Silence can be something that throws people off, something that brings up a lot of fear. Because when the mind is unmanaged like this, it can go anywhere. Especially if we think that the thoughts that come into our head are ours, that they're a reflection of our true personality, they're a reflection of who we really are. That gives us only so many tools to manage them. So the Buddha has us turn this kind of pattern on its head, because these feedback loops aren't something that only operate in the negative sense. They're also something that can operate in the sense of being positive. In other words, when they're unguarded, when the mind is unguarded, when it's unrestrained, when it's just let to go wherever it wants, it cycles towards negative things. It's much easier to let the mind settle on something negative than it is to train it towards something positive. But the nice thing about all this is that there is this kind of opportunity to train, because these kind of thoughts that come into a person's head in silence are not ours. We don't own them. They're something that we have the choice whether to follow or whether to leave alone. They're something that we have the choice to replace with something better or to eliminate something that's bad. And what this means is that these feedback loops that happen in the mind are something that we have some control over. There's something that we can put a different input to. It's kind of like if a person, has the kind of like a microphone towards the speaker, and the kind of sound is getting louder and louder and louder. If that person thinks that's their true self, it's like a person who just holds the microphone there, kind of never moves it. But when a person knows that whatever thoughts come into their head are not theirs, they don't own them, and they're not all to be trusted, they have a whole different set of options. They can shut the microphone off, they can move it away from the speaker. Instead of having it have this loud sound near the speaker, they can take it and put it near their mouth and say something positive into it. In other words, a whole different set of options arise when a person abandons their attachment to their thoughts, when a person abandons their self-identity around their thoughts, when a person abandons their views around their thoughts. But this is something that can be frightening. It's something that can be frightening. So I remember on that first retreat, kind of be sitting there in silence, nobody saying anything, and your thoughts just go all over the place. Kind of like, when am I going to eat? I remember I tried this thing where I thought like, okay, I'm going to make this retreat easier, and I thought I'll just kind of, fall asleep on the cushion, nobody will notice, and I'll just sleep, whenever things get, too stressful. But then the thing that happened was I woke up, and my thoughts were like, much more active than they were before. There's basically no escaping, no escaping them on these kind of retreats. So it left with the only option was to kind of focus on the meditation object. It's basically the only refuge you have in a situation like that. Either that or run away. Kind of get up out of the retreat and, storm out the door. This food wasn't tasty enough and people were breathing loud. Or kind of, run out the door and go to the nearest McDonald's and eat a burger, something like that. But if a person doesn't do that, if a person stays on a retreat, if a person is in a situation where they're in silence, they're in a situation where the only tool that they have to combat whatever feedback loops arise is their practice. They have their wisdom, they have their mindfulness, and this is what they can use to shape their mind. This is what they can use to shape their thoughts. The amazing thing about this is that whatever kind of fears come up in the mind as a result of the mind throwing thoughts, whatever thoughts come up in the mind that one doesn't like, perceptions one doesn't like, negative thinking. All these various things are basically no match for the combined power of what they call sati and panya, kind of mindfulness and discernment. Now, mindfulness here means, in one portion, the ability to keep something in mind. And this is emphasized all the time in the Buddhist texts. This ability to take something in your mind and put it there and keep it there, without it falling away, without it going anywhere else. And if this sounds familiar, one of the reasons is that's precisely what a person does in their meditation practice. Kind of learn to keep the breath in mind. That's why it's called anapanasati. Anapana, I think, means in and out breath. And then sati means mindfulness. In other words, we keep this in our mind. So when a person learns to do this as a skill, keep what they want in their mind, what they're essentially learning to do is have the capacity to develop feedback loops of their own. They have the capacity to put a thought in their head and keep it there. And that's a very important skill for somebody to change the patterns in the mind, change the way the mind goes out, change the way the mind runs around, is to develop this capacity to put something in the mind and keep it there. In other words, we learn to make the patterns in our mind what we choose, what we want. But this is something that takes practice, something that doesn't happen kind of overnight. It's something that we practice doing. We practice it on the cushion. We practice it when negative thoughts, when bad modes of thinking come up, we replace them with something else. And this brings us to the second quality that is important, that is used to overcome negative thoughts. And this is this quality of panya, or discernment. Now it's interesting, the Buddha had these kind of two chief disciples. One of them was famed for psychic power. Psychic power, there's all these various psychic powers. This comes from this kind of intuition, what you might call like the more intuitive side of the mind, the ability for the mind to calm down, which is what we generally try to do in our meditation. Not for the sake of psychic powers, but for the, for the sake of making the mind calm down. But there's this other side to Buddhist practice, this other side to training the mind, which is discernment. And the Buddha's foremost chief disciple was named Venerable Sariputta. He was foremost in discernment, foremost in what they call panya, roughly translated as discernment. And this is the ability to draw a line. It's basically the ability to draw a line between what's skillful, what's not skillful. Yeah? So this is the interesting thing about the thoughts that arise in the mind. Sometimes they can start on a skillful track, thinking about the weather, thinking about whatever it might be, and then all of a sudden the weather turns into some thought that links to another thought that links, way over here to something negative. So this mindfulness, this ability to keep something in mind, also means this ability to watch. Also have this kind of capacity. The Buddha compares it to a gatekeeper. In other words, a gatekeeper stands at a kind of gate and he keeps in mind who can come in and who can't. When somebody who can't come in comes there, somebody comes up to the gate, they're carrying all kinds of weapons. Okay, you stay out. Somebody comes into the gate, they're carrying a caravan with lots of goods. Okay, you can come in. In other words, they watch, they observe. And this gatekeeper who watches and observes, he has to have this quality of discernment, this quality of being able to separate who's good from who's bad. And this is a quality that's also very important in a person's mind, in a person's practice. When a thought comes up, when an intention comes up, when a wish comes up, is this good or is it bad? Is it something that I should leave in my mind? Is it something that I should cut out? Is it something that I should listen to? Is it something I shouldn't listen to? And it's right here that a person develops skill. A person develops a skill in directing their mind, in creating the feedback loops that they want to create. Because when a person has this kind of mindfulness, this ability to keep something in mind, they have this kind of wisdom to know what's skillful and what's not skillful. These are the qualities they need to put the thoughts in their head that will continue to grow in happiness, that will continue to grow in calm, that will continue to grow in ease. But the thing about this, one of the interesting things about the Buddha, is that he didn't really kind of go out and save people in the sense that it was like, okay, now you're saved, you don't have to do anything. All the time, each person is always the owner of their own kamma, the owner of their own minds. And what that means is that it's up to each person to make their mind a good place to be, to make their mind a nice place to be, to make their mind a place where these feedback loops are building in positive directions, in positive things, where they've cultivated their mind well. So actually sometimes kind of walk around, on the streets, there's this nice kind of conservation area between Pickering and Scarborough. It's called Petticoat Creek. And you kind of walk on these streets to get there. There's these kind of nice little paths. And there's one guy who has this kind of like landscaping company. And whenever I pass by his house, it's like this amazing, like house. He's got, well, his house is normal looking, but his land, like his landscaped land, is like an advertisement for his business. So he has like all these waterfalls and, like statues. It's stunningly beautiful. You can kind of stop. The whole of his property is like that. It's like all these kind of fountains and, big stones and like trees. It's really nicely done. It's kind of like a heavenly realm. And he spent a lot of time cultivating that land that way, cultivating it to make it look good, taking out the things that are bad, replacing them with things that are beneficial. And this is what a person's practice is like. With this kind of mindfulness, with this wisdom, one learns to put a few fountains here and there in one's mind. One learns to mow the grass a little bit. One learns to plant a few trees. And if one does this, then one's mind can become a good place to be. A place where a person wants to stay. A place where a person wants to hang out. Now, when mind becomes a good place to be, a good place to stay, that's when a person's mind can settle in on their breath, can settle in with their meditation object, because they feel they have what they need right here. They feel they have the happiness they need inside. They have the ease they need inside. And it's building on that happiness and ease that a person can take their practice further, can take their practice from the happiness and ease that comes from thinking good thoughts, doing good deeds, to the happiness and ease that comes from the mind settling down, from the mind being still, from the mind not needing anything except what it has right there. So for a person who cultivates this, then it can become like their mind is like one of these fountains. The guy's yard kind of starts gushing feelings of ease. Mm-hmm. And this is a skill that people can develop. This is what happens when, instead of having the microphone near kind of like a negative feedback loop, or me, create a kind of positive feedback loop where the good things that a person puts into their mind build on each other. One builds on the other, on the other, on the other. Kind of like this kind of compound interest. But all of this, for people who really desire what's for their ease, has discernment as its kind of chief quality. Because in whatever way the mind calms down, that's when a person can turn their discernment to try to see what it is that's really causing them to suffer. They can turn their investigations to try to find it, to try to see where it is in their own mind. And it's this that lets a person separate. Lets a person separate what's good from what's bad, to cut out the defilements in their own mind. So there are many treasures to be found in cultivating a person's practice. There's many good things that a person can put in their mind. Fountains, few nice trees, some big rocks, that make the mind a good place to stay. And a person's companions for doing these things, two of their treasures, is to have this gatekeeper, have this kind of mindfulness, this ability to take something and put it in the mind and keep it there. This is the counter to a lot of the negative thinking that a person has. A person has a negative thought, put a positive thought to counter it, and keep it there. Let it grow some roots. Water it well. And that's when a person's mind starts to become a little bit landscape. And then also to have this quality of discernment, the ability to know what to cut out and what to leave, what's good and what's bad, Who's coming in carrying weapons? Okay, you can't come. Who's coming in carrying goods? Okay, come on in. Because whatever negative qualities there are in the mind, whatever suffering there is in the mind, it's no match for the combined power of mindfulness and wisdom. Mindfulness and wisdom are qualities that can help us make our mind a good place to stay. A place where we'll feel at ease, a place that's well landscaped. It's something that will give us a foundation to build further in our practice towards finding a happiness that's true.